The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time. What can I say that hasn't been said in the nearly 20 years since this game was released to high critical acclaim back in 1998 for the Nintendo 64?
Nothing? Well, moving on to Batman Season 4.
In all seriousness, this game is one that if you're watching this channel, you must have heard of at least once. Like I said, when looking at lists of the best games of all time or the highest rated games of all time, this is one game that frequently finds itself at the top of those charts without fail. Having sold over 7 million copies on N64 and has been re-released on an infinite amount of consoles, remastered on the GameCube, and remade for the Nintendo 3DS in 2011. I, as well as many people, love version comparisons, and here on Jay's Reviews, this is something that's been done numerous times, whether it be my video on Ratchet 1 versus the PS4 game, Mega Man X versus Maverick Hunter X, Metal Gear Solid versus the Twin Snakes, and other minor version comparisons like the Sly Collection, the Jack Collection, or hell, the previous Zelda video, A Link to the Past, where I spent a small amount of time talking about the GBA version. Despite not having grown up with this game in my younger years like I did many of my other favorite franchises, Ocarina of Time still remains a game that's very important to me. I might have said this in passing a few times, but in 2013, following the release of that game, you all know the one, I decided to check out more franchises that I hadn't before. A practice that's still ongoing, resulting in me reviewing games and franchises that I never thought I'd ever play, let alone have people really interested to see what I have to say about them. In the spring of that year, I'd become quite the Uncharted fan, playing through the whole trilogy and getting excited when Uncharted 4 got announced that fall. As for the summer, I had gotten back into the Ratchet games via Ratchet 2 on the HD collection, and if I wasn't trying to finish New Game Plus in Ratchet 2, or replaying Sly 2 for the upteenth time, I was most certainly playing The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time 3D for my 3DS. A game I'd only picked up recently at that time, which resulted in me becoming a giant fan of the series with over 100 hours put into this game in particular. Which is why for this review, we're going to give it the versus battle treatment, with the next review being Majora's Mask, with Wind Waker following that one. Anyway, with this game being Ocarina of Time, I'll spare you the juicy details of the development history, since while there are many things to say in regards to that, since Ocarina of Time was the series' first jump into the third dimension, you've probably heard it before, and in more detail than I'd be likely to put in. As a result, this review will focus on my thoughts on these two versions and the design as a whole. I remember back in my Sly 2 review, I'd really praised the opening cinematic in this game. This will be a theme when talking about the story of Ocarina of Time, but I think the title screen is generally taken for granted since it's a pretty simple scene in concept and execution. It's just Link riding his horse through Hyrule Field. However, considering what we've seen prior to this in the Zelda series, this must have blown the minds of so many fans that had been with the series since 1986. I still think it's equally effective, if not as revolutionary, in this day and age. Jump the gun a bit, Link can ride a horse in this game, and in fact it's a pretty big mechanic, so now that you've been told there is a horse to unlock via the title screen, you'd remember to try and find one in the game. But I digress. How is the story? A Link to the Past had taken the series back in time and showed the backstory of the NES duology, with Link's Awakening being released next and took place after A Link to the Past. Ocarina once again goes back further in time, and as of this point it was the earliest game in the timeline. Now, A Link to the Past, its sequels, and the NES games are a split timeline from Ocarina of Time, which if you are a long-time subscriber, you'd remember my video defending the Zelda timeline, since the meme that the timeline is bad needs to die. How about the story we did get in Ocarina? If you've played A Link to the Past, it's very similar to that. Link is identified as the boy without a fairy since every kid in the village has one. At the same time, he has a series of nightmares which are events that occur later in the game. The father figure for all these kids is the Great Deku Tree, who sends the fairy, Navi, out to bring Link to him to begin his quest and follow his destiny, which means leaving the village and friends to meet Princess Zelda, who holds the magical Ocarina of Time. She sends Link across Hyrule to find the spiritual stones, which alongside the Ocarina of Time itself, will open the door to the Sacred Realm as well as the Master Sword. This quest will introduce Link to the various races like the mountain-dwelling Gorons, the sea creatures known as the Zoras, and so on. At the same time, a man of the Gerudo species named Ganondorf works his way inside the castle and uses the plot of Link and Zelda to his advantage to gain access to the Sacred Realm, and with it, the Triforce, the mystical triangles that grant power, wisdom, and courage. Link disappears and Ganondorf takes over the world, with Link reawakening 7 years later with the Master Sword in hand to find the 7 sages with the help of a ninja called Sheik so that they can gain the power to defeat Ganondorf. You see, I could go into more specifics in that regard, but that's the story summed up, so let's discuss it. In my MGS3 video, I had a chart of character-driven stories versus plot-driven, with Ocarina of Time being the furthest example on the plot-driven side, and the 2 playthroughs I did for this review have certainly validated my doing so. Remember, there is nothing wrong with either approach to storytelling, since the plot in Ocarina of Time is well done. However, I'll just say right off the bat that I'm not very engaged with its characters. The events that happen in the world building is what keeps me playing. Because, for example, in both versions, Link himself is not an interesting character to follow. I know he's supposed to connect you to the game, and while this is hindsight logic, I'm going to say it anyway. When I played Wind Waker or Twilight Princess, they were going for the same thing, but I was more invested in those stories since Link was given a great visual personality to engage the players with. When Saria, a childhood friend, says goodbye to Link on his way out, he just walks out the door. While it's neat that the 7 sages are all characters Link has come to know via his quest for the spiritual stones, I just can't say I'm on the edge of my seat when we rescue them in the latter half of the game, since again, Link doesn't have much of a reaction to anything outside of a blank stare or a shocked face. Despite that, I am a fan of the plot twist around the middle of the game where Link learns that he's not a true member of the Kokiri village he was in at the beginning. The Kokiri were a new race for the series, and so their ways were a mystery. Link grows up like you'd expect, but you'd return to the village later only to see the same faces from 7 years ago looking the exact same as they did back then, obviously raising a few questions about Link himself. Questions that are answered by the revived Great Deku Tree, who tells Link that as a baby his mother was wounded in the war going on at the time and left him with the Great Deku Tree as she died. Pretty dark stuff, but more to come later. My thoughts on Link also apply to Zelda herself. As everyone knows by now, Sheik and Zelda are one and the same, and she used the Sheik identity to hide from Ganondorf, which is a fantastic plot twist, although I never thought much of it when I first played this game since I had played Melee and Brawl before this. However, when I was playing the game for the review, I was thinking back in '98 it must have blown plenty of people's minds, although from my memory there aren't many examples of foreshadowing in regards to this. And trust me, I've played Ocarina many times. I feel like this is the most important part when it comes to nailing a good plot twist, since it makes a revisit more satisfying as you discover something about the story you wouldn't have picked up on when experiencing it for the first time. There are attempts at misdirection, most notably when Ruto the Water Sage describes Sheik as a man, but that's all I've got. I do like how Zelda's plan at the beginning leads to Hyrule's ruin, which shows that she's not a completely flawless person, but if I'm going to complain about something, it would be that she never really does much. And the same goes for Sheik. Her role in the story is standing there, still standing there, and dumping exposition while doing it. A very guilty scene in regards to limited movement is the final scene where Link and Zelda say their goodbyes, but despite not thinking they're the most engaging characters out there, I still felt something in this moment as the huge journey we just completed comes to an end with a goodbye to an old friend. Anyway, as for the other scenes that just involve characters talking, I feel like there have to be ways to make exposition feel like a natural conversation or event, but Ocarina misses the mark by a large margin, which is actually one of my biggest issues with the story, and the main reason why I think the story is plot-driven. Most of the cutscenes have extremely minimal animation with all characters, not just Zelda, standing around and telling you things. This isn't a result of the text speed in the N64 version, by the way. I'm speaking about the way cutscenes look and feel, and this carries over to both versions. When more interesting things happen, like Zelda and Impa's escape from Ganondorf, I'm all in. But when Link is just standing there being told what to do by Rauru the Light Sage, or when they switch to these visual aids to describe long exposition, I'm bored. Cutscenes in MGS1 felt more cinematic, and when exposition was happening, it was via the codec screens with fantastic voice acting to back it up. But now I'm gonna have to pose a question that I frequently have to. Do these things ruin my enjoyment of the story in Ocarina of Time? And the answer to that is no. The thing is, since this is a review assessing what I think of the game, I feel inclined to talk about the things it does right and wrong. Considering the things I've just laid out, like not interesting protagonists and slow-paced, unstimulating cutscenes, this game still has a really good story, so let's look at why. I love how epic the journey feels, particularly thanks to the fact that Link starts the game as a child and ends it as an adult, which makes you feel like you are growing in skill as a player at the same time Link grows in age. Of course, it doesn't age in real time, we get 2 ages, 10 and 17, but still, it feels grand. The escalation of the difficulty is a massive contributor to this as well. I remember when I was facing the final boss against Ganon, I backflipped to avoid his sword strike, and while doing so I had an epiphany. That this was the same backflip I did at the beginning of the game while training with some rocks in the village. It just feels like you've come far when you lay the final blow, since by this point you've left your village behind, stuck into the castle, traveled through time, through forests, mountains, caves, oceans, deserts, and so on. One of the best aspects of this story is Ganondorf himself. In this game, his motive for taking over the kingdom isn't particularly spelled out or very deep, he just wants to do it. But he does it with such passion and ambition, stopping at nothing to achieve his goals, which creates a villain that you love to hate. Even his name is pretty clever. In the manual for A Link to the Past, it stated that Ganon was once a thief by the name of Ganondorf Dragmire, who transformed into Ganon before being sealed away. So it's very cool that this game shows us that transformation. We don't see him much, and I think that adds to the effect, starting with the part where Link stands up to him to no avail, establishing him as a physical threat. So the next time you think you're about to face him, there's tension in the air. This is of course a fake Ganondorf, but that builds up even more tension by the time you slowly climb the castle, with his organ getting louder and louder as you climb the steps. At the time, this was probably the darkest Nintendo game ever made, starting with Ganondorf's insurrection. A common meme about this plot is that past the castle town, Hyrule is better off since...
Hey, in the Child Link era, there were monsters roaming around in the day and night time, but none of that in the adult era. Ganondorf has made the world so much better. Ha ha ha. I am so original.
I'm actually going to give a large sum of praise to how well this was handled, since in actuality, all the areas you come to know and love have been corrupted. Monsters are infecting the village you grew up in. The Gorons in the mountains have all been captured and about to be executed. The Zora's domain has been frozen over, and the happy people in the castle town have been forced out of their homes and crammed into Kakariko village. Lon Lon Ranch is now run by the greedy Ingo, with Malon, the farm girl he met as a child, being forced to work or else the animals will be abused. Needless to say, this world is pretty screwed up. But by exploring the dungeons, rescuing the sages, you yourself are contributing to these societies being put back on track, which makes the gameplay and the story come together as a unified whole. I remember the part after Link first meets Ganondorf, where he goes to the Temple of Time. If you go through the back alley, you'll find a soldier from the castle saying he tried to stop Ganondorf, but he failed, and then he gives you some direction to the temple, but immediately succumbs to his wounds and dies. And that's just it for him. Visual storytelling is often implemented to enhance the atmosphere. A great example being in the Shadow Temple, where you find this room with wooden pillars and blood on the ground. People were hung here, but that's just my interpretation of the room, which is no more valid than any other, which is the best thing about imagery like this. Although it's a bit lame that the 3DS version censored that. Many other creatures you'll find throughout the game will also evoke a sense of dread regarding Hyrule and its history. Like, where do these disgusting underground monstrosities even come from? Who knows? But man, is it interesting. You might be surprised, but that pretty much is all I have to say about Ocarina of Time's story. It is really good. While I don't find many of the characters very interesting, I like Ganondorf as a villain. I enjoy the dark atmosphere, which gives the mission a sense of urgency. It's also a great coming-of-age story with good plot twists to keep the first playthrough interesting. It was easily the best Zelda story done up to that point. However, it isn't anything too complicated on its own merits. But it was successful at being cinematic. For example, Link always slowly opens chests and stares in awe before you see what's inside, and while A Link to the Past didn't bother with that, it doesn't matter to me because games were becoming increasingly more cinematic, like I said. So Ocarina of Time doing this makes perfect sense, seeing as the story and the gameplay were being merged into one as previously stated. On the subject of cinematics, how about the presentation? I should probably start by clarifying how I played Ocarina of Time for this review. The original Ocarina was released in the N64, but I don't have an N64, so I couldn't play it off of that for the most genuine experience. I do own emulated versions of Ocarina 64 on the Wii and Wii U, however many of the pixels are smoothed over, creating a less than accurate image. Ocarina was re-released in the GameCube twice as a part of the Zelda Collection and a separate Master Quest bundle, which alters the level design to make the game more difficult. A thing that the 3DS version comes with by default that horizontally inverts the whole game and changes dungeon layouts. It's like what was done on Twilight Princess when going from the GameCube to the Wii. Anyway, for the most beautiful pixels, I played Ocarina of Time in the Zelda Collection via component cables on the Nintendo Wii, which went to my ex-RGB Mini FrameMeister to get a pixel-perfect 480p screen resolution. As for the Nintendo 3DS version, this is where I would put my capture card.
If I had one!
So thankfully, Ocarina of Time 3D is one of the few games to run perfectly on the Citra emulator, so that's what I used. I did play up to the Fire Temple on a legit 3DS, so my thoughts on it wouldn't be biased or anything like that. Of course, all this is avoiding the question of how good the graphics actually are, and starting with the N64 version, I've got to say, it really doesn't hold up. Where do I begin? Well, many of the areas look fine, like the villages and towns you visit look okay, I suppose, but nothing special. The areas in Super Mario 64, which was released 2 years prior, has the better looking environments. The real issue lies with the overusage of 2D assets in place of 3D models, like these 2D trees or 2D items, janky 2D vines to climb, 2D boundaries for the overworld, and the worst offender when it comes to this pre-rendered shite is Hyrule Castletown. What the hell is this mess? It just looks unnatural. What you're looking at is a PNG that's been compressed to hell and back to fit into a cartridge, and putting these 3D models into the environment looks awful, especially with the grand shot of the Temple of Time. It probably looks far less out of place when playing the game on a CRT with composite cables like was intended, but look at other games from 1998. Not only are the areas bigger, but they have more detail and more frames of animation, Crash 3 especially. On the subject of Crash 3, I think that game really shows my point off the best. Those areas were detailed with high quality cutscenes that had tons of animation in them, which makes this game just look lacking. Ocarina looks okay, but again, nothing more than okay. Well, except for the character models. These are just fugly. I like the look of Link and Ganondorf as well as the other races, but many of the human characters and Princess Zelda especially are just fugly to the worst extent.
Despite not thinking the character models are very good, I love the art style of Ocarina of Time, especially the character designs as shown in the Hyrule Historia. Very strong outlines, very just strong designs in general that leave an impact and stand out from the competition. The version released for the 3DS is a huge contrast by comparison. All the models have been redone, meaning that Zelda is no longer Uncanny Nightmare fuel, as well as actually animating this time. Speaking of animation, the animations are much smoother as well, which is partly thanks to the fact that the 20 frames per second in the original has been increased to 30 frames per second. Honestly though, the animation in Ocarina 3D looks so smooth that I would have been convinced it was 60 frames per second if I hadn't done the research to see it was 30. Although it's worth mentioning that during the fight with Ganondorf, you must shoot him with the light arrows that Zelda gave to you, and in the original nothing's out of place here, but in 3D this causes a massive amount of slowdown. Nothing unplayable, but still something that surprised me when I first played this game, since the 3DS version didn't have any other moments of slowdown from my memory. One of the biggest changes made to Ocarina 3D was the text speed. This and the water temple were the two biggest and most common criticisms tossed at Ocarina 64. I don't think the text speed was truly the worst thing ever though, because I think if you have played the game before and are just trying to get through it, then it's slow and tedious. But when I was reading it normally, I didn't have a problem. However, in the 3DS version we have the best of both worlds, with text that flies by in less than a second. And if you want to read it, go ahead. But if you don't want to, you don't have to. In addition to that, all those hideous 2D assets have been replaced with fully 3D ones, which is much appreciated, thus making the atmosphere even stronger in the darkest parts of the game. This is the part where I would talk about the soundtrack and show some of my favorites, but this is a Nintendo game, so I won't even bother. I can tell you this much though, Koji Kondo composed, so it's good. In all seriousness, I would like to go into more specifics, but instead I'll just say that Ocarina's soundtrack definitely goes for a less catchy style than the previous games, a decision that I think works. In particular, the dungeons have very atmospheric pieces accompanying them, as to not get too repetitive if you were in a dungeon for a long time. With the themes of the Spirit Temple, the Shadow Temple, the Water Temple, and Jabu Jabu's Belly standing out in terms of being quiet and atmospheric but memorable at the same time. Outside of the dungeons is where we hear more traditional Zelda pieces like Hyrule Field, or Castle Town, or Gerudo Valley, and the returning Kakariko Village. All of which were incredibly catchy, with a nice touch being how Kakariko Village sounds very pleasant and upbeat in the past, but in the future is a bit slower and has more of a somber edge to it. A tiny complaint I can issue is that the loops for these pieces are incredibly short, oftentimes not lasting a whole minute, which becomes noticeable in editing this review. On the whole, however, Ocarina has a strong soundtrack that, while not the best in the series, it was most certainly worthy of accompanying this grand adventure. The game itself follows the same structure as A Link to the Past. In fact, it's very similar. Link must complete 3 dungeons at first to gain access to the Master Sword, and then a shift in the overworld happens as the player can switch between the two at will after one dungeon. It's pretty similar to the MG2 and MGS1 case. The previous game was a few years old, and the developers decided not to shake up the formula too much since they had to get the gameplay right first and foremost, and get crazy later. On that note, controlling Link is incredibly intuitive. He moves with the analog stick, attacks with the B button, and does contact-sensitive actions with the A button. Actions such as pushing blocks, pulling blocks, climbing ledges, rolling, talking, dodging, etc. I was about to say jumping, but that's not very accurate. Jumping is entirely automatic, so that the A button can be saved for other functions. The rationale being that Mario was the platformer, so why have Link control the same? That's what you gotta love about Nintendo. Instead of cramming every stupid idea they have into a Mario game, they just make a new IP out of it where it'll be more appropriate. The N64 had one analog stick, and so the camera just locks behind Link. If you need to reset it, then you can tap the Z button to fix the camera. When in battle, the Z button will be used for the incredibly innovative Z targeting. Navi will lock onto enemies as you can strafe around them from left to right. When I say innovative, I mean Mario 64 and the analog stick innovative. You have to remember that this generation was all about innovation, learning how to make games in 3D properly. Some conventions in 2D would just not translate to the third dimension. I think a great example would be the one I used in my Ratchet 1 review. There was no precedent for how to do combat in 3D before this game. Mega Man Legends released before Ocarina, and those developers had to come up with a way to do strafing themselves, which was okay, but certainly not ideal. Mega Man Legends 2 was released after Ocarina of Time, and look at that. Targeting onto enemies just feels natural. Therefore, games after this, without it, were just inefficient by comparison. Certainly, games to come out after had done the strafing better, where you can control yourself at full speed all the while being locked on. This absolutely gets the job done. Navi is also there to help you out if need be. And can I say that Navi being annoying is another Ocarina meme that needs to die? Seriously, I do not understand. Every once in a million years she'll say, hey, listen, and then you have the option of pressing up and talking to her. And sometimes she interrupts you to give vital info, but if she didn't, I feel like complaints will be made that she didn't do enough. So, moving on.
Later games, including the 3D version, will give you the option of holding down the target button to lock on, or just pressing it once and pressing it again to change targets. I've always preferred the switch mode, and the N64 games have it that way on default, and no option to change it to hold. Funnily enough, I only ever learned of this because my finger slipped when playing Majora 64 once, but that's neither here nor there. Since the controls worked so well back in the original Ocarina, the 3DS version doesn't make many changes in regard to controlling Link. Although, of course, it just feels smoother than it did before, especially in regards to aiming your weapons. The game was obviously built for the N64, and I hear aiming on that version is fine, but on the GameCube, it's unbelievably slippery to the point where accuracy is almost impossible to achieve, making the arrow minigame incredibly annoying. The 3DS version vastly improves on the aiming sensitivity, making the moments requiring first-person precision as smooth as butter. Although if that wasn't enough for you, the 3DS's gyroscope is also of use here as well. Aiming this way was a bit off for me at first, moving the system around to aim, but after some getting used to it, it works really well and creates an even greater sense of interactivity. You can also use the gyroscope to view your surroundings, so it's good to make use of that. You might not agree, but I find combat to be one of the best parts in Ocarina of Time. I don't know, I just find it incredibly satisfying to lock on enemies, roll and hop out of the way of their attacks. You find the perfect moment to strike. Almost all the enemies have some kind of trick to them that makes them easier to deal with when you know how to do it. I'll mention right now that the jumping slash is the hardest hitting attack in the game, so be sure to rely on it. If I'm not doing that, then I also get a kick out of the spin attack you do by spinning the analog stick and mashing the attack button. It doesn't do too much damage, but it does add up since it can be chained in rapid succession. Back to what I was saying though, these wolf enemies will briefly expose their tails and that's a one-hit kill. These night guys can be lured into the support beams for the ceiling and destroy them, which will release hearts for you, which is good since they hit quite hard. The act of outsmarting the enemy is great as well. Well, you might say that fighting these skull guys with shields takes too long, but I enjoy how you can lead them into attacking you as you dodge out of the way and strike. The escalation of the difficulty is also very well done. I remember when I first played Ocarina 3D back in 2013, I got to this part of the forest temple and I had to fight one of these guys in the middle of the dungeon. It was literally like fighting a final boss. I died an uncountable amount of times. However, I finally beat him, only to see two of them rise in his place, and I got my ass kicked there too. But when I overcame that challenge, they never gave me a problem again as I can effortlessly kick their asses this time around. It's this kind of difficulty curve that's satisfying to overcome. This is a process that will extend to the majority of the opponents in Ocarina of Time. Maybe the Iron Knuckles or Gerudos will do the same thing to you, but learning the patterns and striking when necessary will be fun in and of itself. Back in my review of A Link to the Past, I had complained that we'd only gotten one item button when the controller had a few unused buttons. Ocarina of Time expands this by giving us the C buttons, which are used for items. Up is used for going in first person and talking to Navi, so we're left with the other three as our item buttons. In reality, we have about 2 item buttons. I see people doing this differently from me all the time, however, what I always do is put the ocarina on the bottom button, since that's without a doubt the item you'll be using the most out of them all, so having it on the fly is good. Having said that, my roster of weapons usually looks the same across the whole game: arrows, ocarina, and the hookshot. I'm not sure why they didn't use the N64's D-pad for additional weapons though. It would have been great to be able to have 7 item slots, but the D-pad goes unused. However, this is not as bad as it was in A Link to the Past, since 3 item buttons is plenty good enough. In the 3DS version, all that stuff is kept at the bottom screen with 2 item buttons being put on the X and Y buttons. The other 2 are touch activated, which is good. Because of this, we now have 4 whole item buttons, and the ocarina gets its own button, like the N64 should have done. As for the items we got, Ocarina brings back your favorites from A Link to the Past with a 3D facelift. Items like the arrows, the hookshots, the bombs, and the bottles used for storing health items, the boomerang, the Megaton hammer, and so on. With L targeting making the transition from 2D aiming to 3D aiming very manageable. Some weapons now have multiple purposes, like how the arrows now have differing properties, like the fire arrows, the ice arrows, and the light arrows. Or how the hookshot is used to grapple from place to place but can also be used to stun enemies. Although the magic rods and spells from the previous games have been removed. Link now also has 3 different tunics to wear. The default green one, the red one which protects against fire, and the blue one which allows you to breathe underwater. Not much really there, it's all cosmetic stuff, but I prefer the blue one the most. New items include the Deku Stick, which is unbelievably more powerful than it has any right to be. No joke, it makes Child Link bosses over in seconds. We also get the ocarina, which actually requires you to play pieces on it that have differing effects, like how the Song of Storms creates a storm, or how the Prelude of Light will warp you to the Temple of Time, Epona's song will call the horse to you when needed, and a long list of others. In the N64 version, you had to remember the notes, but if you forgot, you could slowly open the menu and slowly switch over to the pieces list. The 3DS version skips that part and displays all the pieces on the bottom screen, which is incredibly useful when in the moment. In either version, I'm still not a huge fan of how there's no way to switch things out in real time. I mean, in Ratchet and Clank, for example, we can go to the pause menu for a full roster of weapons and pick the one we want. We can still set our favorites to the quick select for easy switching. With the touch controls, the 3DS version doesn't irk me too much, it just would have been nice. The N64 version is the real pace breaker with how slow it is to switch between the screens, and how you have to pause all the damn time to get a bomb or switch the color of your suit. And the infamous example of switching the iron and hover boots out, which is something that people who love this game to death want nothing to do with, since it's just that tedious. In fact, it made a high quality puzzle like the Water Temple have this infamous legacy. Speaking of the Water Temple, how are the dungeons in Ocarina? I haven't played this game for a few years, but when I came back to it, I was scared this was going to be another Tools of Destruction, a Crack in Time scenario, which actually was going to make me ponder why I review games to begin with if all it means is that I don't enjoy games I used to. The reason I was thinking that might happen here was because I was playing Ocarina, and for the first 3 dungeons, I was basically on autopilot, not really having any fun. Once the game truly began after Link got the Master Sword, all that went away because I was enjoying the game as much as I always have. Problem I have with these opening dungeons is how meh they are. Even Jabu Jabu. Yes, I agree that they needed to be simple to get people into 3D Zelda since it had never been done before. However, does that make it fun in and of itself? I don't think so. Are they too linear? I suppose. I guess the root of my problem is that I just don't get a great deal of satisfaction of going through here, whether it be fighting enemies or solving the lacking puzzles. Beyond that, I can't quite put my finger on what I don't like here, since all I can say is that I wasn't having fun.
I think another one of the largest issues has got to be the overusage of tutorials in this game, and it all stems from the text speed, which I already did talk about, but like I said, there's the boring cutscenes, there's the long text speed, it just makes the game's opening a crawl, especially with the owl always talking over you, always stopping you dead in your progress, that sort of thing that just drags down the pace.
That doesn't stop the later dungeons from having lacking puzzles though. I couldn't tell you why, but the developers had a huge hard-on for pushing and pulling blocks. Why? This is not a puzzle, people. Link ever so slowly pushes and pulls these bricks and puts them where they belong. Even when getting the silver and golden gauntlets to lift massive obstacles, we still can't push these blocks at a faster speed. I say these aren't puzzles since you see the space it's supposed to go in and bam, you've already figured it out. Now all that's left is spending the 30 seconds to a minute it takes to push the damn blocks. When I think of a puzzle, I think of actually having to use logic to come to a solution where every step of the way you're thinking. In a game, it should feel interactive. For example, I'd much rather decipher some tap code in Metal Gear 2 instead of this. Beyond that, though, I really do enjoy the Adult Link dungeons since they offer a good amount of combat, and the other puzzles that take advantage of your spatial awareness are really good, in addition to having great visual design and variety. In the N64 version, I don't even mind the Water Temple that much.
The iron boots are a massive stain on a great dungeon,
but I like how it's one of the hardest ones. You need to know that there are 3 water levels to use, and remember that so you can properly proceed. The 3DS version even labels the rising water rooms so you can know where their locations are. The only part I didn't like was how a key was hidden under this brick that you raised, but the 3DS version adds a cutscene panning towards that room, so no big deal there. The Spirit Temple is one of my favorites as well, since it combines everything you've learned up to this point as child and adult Link as you use the two to get to the center and defeat the boss battle with some really good puzzles that only work in 3D, like the creatures that mimic your movements only in reverse. You need to lead them into a ring of fire by going in the opposite direction of said fire, or you could just do it my way. The Forest Fire and Shadow Temples are all really linear, but that's not a problem whatsoever since the ride itself was quite enjoyable, like battling the ghosts in the Forest Temple, freeing the Gorons in the Fire Temple, and using the Lens of Truth combined with the hover boots to navigate through the Shadow Temple's depths. There are also some mini dungeons to go through, and The bottom of the well as Child Link gives that loser RZ trouble, but if you walk in a straight line, it's already over before it even begins, with the Gerudo stealth section causing many players, including me, grief since this camera is terrible, leading to getting caught when it wasn't your fault. Another problem is when fighting them, you get caught after like 1 or 2 hits, which is complete crap since my health bar wasn't empty. Therefore adding unwanted challenge to these encounters since you're never quite sure when you're gonna die if you take a hit or 2. So if all those dungeons were enough to keep you busy, the side quests pick up the slack? I'm stating that as a question since this is so bottom of the barrel shite. I'll just cut to the chase by saying, don't 100% Ocarina of Time. It is so not worth it, and the stuff you have to do is really tedious. EXO was talking about intrinsic versus extrinsic reward in his Sunshite review, and the conclusion was that that game is a huge example of doing things for intrinsic value, whereas this game is the definition of doing things for extrinsic value. Look at the big Goron sword hunt. You have to trade all this crap between a bunch of different people, trek all over the land, and take about an hour doing so, for the sole purpose of getting a stronger sword at the beginning of the adult half. There is nothing fun about giving this carpenter his thing back, or racing to Death Mountain only to find out that the big Goron has eye problems and needs drops, only to then go get said drops and race back. Collecting gold Skulltulas isn't much fun since there are too many and sometimes they appear only at night and so on. Far too much chance is involved in this process. You only do it for rewards. Nothing is fun about these janky fishing physics to get a heart piece, or waiting for some big ghost to appear to get the 4th bottle, or showing every single person in existence the masks from the Happy Mask salesman and hoping you pick the right one. For what? Heart pieces? Who cares about that? Who needs 20 hearts to beat Ocarina of Time? Or any 3D Zelda for that matter? I know I certainly don't. So heed my warning. Don't bother doing this shite. Other than the big Goron sword, which is totally worth it for the added strength in combat, this game is perfectly fine without all that stuff. In Hyrule itself, I feel like a lot of these secrets are really obtuse. In A Link to the Past, praise is always given to how the game throws you a bone with cracked walls and such, which makes finding secrets more fun. This hardly carried over into Ocarina of Time. In fact, I only know of a few of these spots and have never found them all without the aid of a guide. Another reason to add to the list of reasons as to why you shouldn't bother 100%ing this game. Speaking of the overworld, many criticisms have been made in regards to the size of it, or rather how barren it feels. I just criticize the obtuse nature of the secrets, but in regards to the map itself, I have to disagree with the common issue. Reason why is because of the way the game is structured. While Child Link may not have some kind of fast travel system, at no point would you ever actually need one. The Kokiri Forest, Death Mountain, and the Zora's Domain are all marked on the right side of the map. You never need to take the long way to Lake Hylia, and you never need to go to the other side of the map for the Gerudo Desert, so the distances you travel are hardly very big. When they are, Epona is available from the very beginning of the adult era, which, like I said at the beginning, you would think to do that since you met the farm folk in the child portion and the title screen displays adult Link riding on a horse, which provides a very serviceable speed increase from going on foot. So for these very reasons, I don't mind the progression or size of the overworld in Ocarina of Time. Last thing, the boss fights. These are some pretty neat set pieces, but as bosses, it's pretty simple stuff. 3DS or N64, it doesn't really matter. You get the dungeon item, you use it on the boss, and they die in 10 seconds. Although it doesn't actually have to be a dungeon item. For example, you need the arrows in the Shadow Temple boss, but same principle, still dies in 10 seconds. If that's not how it works, then it's either A, a lot of time in between hits like the boss in Jabu Jabu or Volvagia, or B, janky gameplay at work that makes it take longer like the first phase of Twin Rova with reflecting the mirror shield, or Chaos -1 requiring precise hook shots. The only one that I actually liked is the final boss. The atmosphere is just amazing. The fact that you only see Ganon's eyes, occasionally seeing his body with a lightning strike, with the silhouettes of the characters contrasting with the fiery background. In addition to the compliments I gave this fight in a story sense earlier, I do get the complaint that the 3DS version brightened it too much, and to that I agree. However, if this were a console, it would be more egregious. My guess is that they had to do it because of the fact that this is a handheld game that can be played on the bus or on the brightness on low, meaning you'll only be able to see your reflection, which would make a tough boss simply unplayable. So as an experience, I can certainly say I prefer an N64, but the 3DS version isn't a bad way to go out either. Having said all that, I was being a bit general throughout this review. The reason for that being, I agree with the internet. This game, it's great. It no longer makes it in my top 10 games of all time or anything, but I believe the experience of playing Ocarina of Time is one that every gamer should go through at least once. For the genre buster that changed the landscape of gaming for over a decade, it holds up incredibly well. Of course, there are issues that have been addressed and fixed in later entries in other games, however the core design of Ocarina was not some broken experiment that has aged like absolute shit. The 5th generation was full of experimentation. Many franchises from the 4th generation had just flamed out during this era since the developers weren't skilled or knowledgeable enough to make 3D work. But the guys who made Ocarina of Time had risen to the challenge and made a game that innovated, set standards, and continues to be praised to this very day. Which had been a detriment to the series for a long time, but we can't take points away from Ocarina for being the blockbuster that it is. Like I said, there are issues with Ocarina, but guess what? You can pop open your 3DS, and get Ocarina 3D, which preserves the amazing game that was already there, but also enhances the graphics, fixes all the technical flaws, and makes a game that will continue to live on until the end of time. The best part is that the 3DS version is widely available, so I highly recommend picking it up if you have a 3DS. The only drawback I think it has the N64 version doesn't have is that I'm at a point in my life where I prefer console games over handhelds by a large margin. Ocarina 3D could definitely benefit from the console treatment, but that doesn't mean it's not the definitive Ocarina experience, since the game design is so strong that it most certainly is the best version on the market. But luckily, you can also experience the N64 version very easily via the Wii U eShop if you're curious enough. So that basically covers it for Ocarina. So while riding the Zelda high, the very next episode will be yet another versus battle on Majora's Mask, the N64 version versus the 3DS version. So stay tuned for that. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you next time.